Weissberg's manuscripts first arrived in an email from the Russian State Library, my jaw hit the floor. I could not believe here was 20, 40 plus manuscripts that had just been sitting in the library for 80 plus years with no one performing them. It was such beautiful music that it felt like we had discovered buried treasure. Julia Weissberg's music was forgotten for a number of reasons. She was a woman, and women composers were, during their lifetime, they might demand attention from society, but then after their deaths, if they're out of sight, out of mind, and society at that time didn't want to acknowledge the genius of a woman composer. That made people feel uncomfortable. So it was easier to forget the work of women artists. It's an incredible privilege. And I'm also just, again, so surprised that nobody has done this work before.
I grew up in Moscow, went to Central Music School, studied composition. I'd never heard about her. I never heard her name. I was so amazed to discover that she was and the kind of music that she composed and the scope of her work. So it is not only a discovery or rediscovery, but it is kind of righting a historical wrong, because we're bringing back into the light somebody who was so superbly gifted and so extremely accomplished in her lifetime.
So Julia Weissberg Rimsky-Korsakov was born in 1878 in Russia, and she had the finest musical education. She went to the St. Petersburg Conservatory. She studied with Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov. She lived in Berlin for several years. She studied with Engelbert Humperdinck and Max Reger, and she was an established composer at that time. In fact, her contemporaries referred to her as the first professional Russian woman composer. They had great respect for her talent, and she did have many opportunities to have her works performed. She wrote art songs, she wrote symphonic poems, she even wrote a symphony, she wrote operas for children, and she was a working composer and one of the founders of the first musicology magazine in Russia. So she was also a writer, so multi-talented. And she unfortunately passed away in the Nazi siege of Leningrad in 1942.
Her connection to Rimsky-Korsakov, of course, was that she studied with the elder, with the Rimsky-Korsakov, and then married his son. Musically speaking, Rimsky-Korsakov was educated, as all Russian musicians, in very German tradition of composing music and understanding music and, looking at Brahms and Bach and Beethoven. But at the same time, he had this incredible love and of color and of Russianness of his background and the music and the presence of the folklore. So I think the combination of that is clearly evident in her music, because it's incredibly colorful and it takes on the cultures and the backgrounds from which the stories of the songs come. And that's why they sound so different. So you have somebody who is so skilled at creating the worlds, the whole soundscapes that represent countries and languages and different cultures, and yet the music is distinctly hers.
Julia Weissberg was a student of Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov at the St. Petersburg Conservatory. And then she subsequently married his son Andrei. That was actually after Nikolai had already passed. But she was a famous composer, a well-known composer in her own right, under her maiden name of Weissberg. She did not change it to become Julia Weissberg or Julia Rimsky-Korsakov after her marriage. So she was confident and secure in her professional identity without the Rimsky-Korsakov name. However, looking back in history for me as a modern singer and grappling with why her music was forgotten, I can't help but think that had she published under the name Yuliya Rimsky-Korsakov, that perhaps her music would not have been forgotten, because we look at some other women composers in history, like Alma Mahler, like Clara Schumann, who share a last name with a very famous male composer. And yes, their work is incredibly good on its own, but it does benefit from that connection. I love the fact that there was no performance tradition to draw on when learning and performing Julia Weissberg's music. It's such a privilege as an artist to be able to have the first opportunity to perform a work. That's why I love to perform newly composed works, but then to find a 20th century late romantic style work where there was no recordings out there, that is just a classically trained singer's dream. Julia's music has so much in it on the page, already there. Sometimes when you're working with music that's not necessarily of the highest quality, you have to feel like your performance needs to elevate it in some way. But when you're working on music that's as good as what Julia Weissberg has written, then it's you as the performer need to rise to that. And so I felt, particularly in working with Konstantin, who is such an accomplished performer and interpreter, that even in his playing, the first time through, I could feel so much more of Julia Weissberg's colors and intentions coming through. And so it was just a pleasure to work in shaping this music.
The way that Julia Weissberg uses the voice and the piano as a duet is, I would say, uniquely her own. And some songs are incredibly modern, like track 15 on the RCD, the staircase, Lunar Staircase, is an incredible usage of the piano in the register that is not expected, right? And then the way that it blends with the voice, it's almost like the overtones, like she's working with the overtones, which is so ahead of this post-romantic style in which she was predominantly writing. I love the way that she asymmetrically creates a vocal phrase. There is always a speech-like pattern that is there in Russian songs, particularly. It's evident in Alone I Set Out, when she's using rests and silences and piano interludes to really make it feel like you hearing your grandmother tell you the truth about life.
Compelling, emotional, and intelligent. These are the words that I would use to describe Julia Weissberg Rimsky-Korsakov's music. One of the main facets of my work as a singer and a researcher is to dive into history and to give voice to underrepresented composers. And by giving them the chance to literally sing for modern audiences, that is giving them the chance to be heard by people who are unencumbered by the prejudices that affected these composers during their lifetime.
Sarah and I go back as colleagues and friends, but it is the first major work we've done together. And it was remarkable to discuss things like breaths and how does this silence work at the beginning of the song. I really feel that we were exactly on the same wavelength as artists, but we did discuss those things, the energy of breath, the things that happen between the notes or before the beginning of the song is so important. And to me, that's part of what makes it so wonderful, this process of being a musician. And seeing that it's equally meaningful and important to Sarah, and that we understand each other, that we have the shorthand of talking about really esoteric things, was just incredible pleasure as a musician to work. The trick is if you're shuffling the CD or listening in sequence, because depending on which track they listen to, they will be moved to tears. They will feel like opening a bottle of champagne or going on a date or reading history books. That's the breadth of experiences with Yuliya's music. And with our record that Sarah curated so well that it really travels through all these completely different states of human condition as represented by music. So there is an intimate sort of lover's dream. There are horror fairy tales from Europe. There are Arabic nights. There are all these things, and fountains and birds. I mean, it is everything and quite a bit more. It was such an incredible surprise to discover that Julia Weissberg exists, and the kind of music that she wrote, and how incredibly diverse her musical language is. So to have that in the canon is invaluable. To imagine, now for me, it's very difficult to think of early 20th century Russian music and not think of her as part of it. It's remarkable that we can now look at the first 20 years, first 30 years of the then new century, 20th century, and say, well, there's this voice there that is different from others. And we get part of the whole spirit of style moderne, the earliest 20th century, symbolism and so-called silver age in Russia. Julia Weissberg's music in 3 words: soulful, sensual, well-constructed. I'll add one more: unexpected. For me, what keeps my creative juices always flowing is that as a performer, we are co-authors of the music. Stanislavski said an actor is a co-author of the play. The moment that we play any music, the weird signs that appear on page come to life, and we give it part of ourselves. And as that, we have to make it ourselves, make it ours, and co-own the music, co-write it, co-create it. So having that first time experience, though, without the hundreds of years of performance practice, of knowing how Horowitz played it or how Leontine Price sang it, doing it for the first time with the music that's 100 years old, and being as honest with the fidelity to the score as one can be, and yet having to make it yours, to own it, to find that resonance within oneself, is the most exciting thing as a performer I can think of.
With the current state of women empowerment, Julia Weissberg Rimsky-Korsakov, she's the GOAT. I mean, she was doing it 100 years before it was in style to do. She empowered other women around her. She used the texts of other women intellectuals from around the world, using her platform to uplift other women. She was totally ahead of her time. This Yuliya album combines 2 of my great passions. I love singing. I love the craft of singing. I love to be in the practice room. But I also love history and I love research. And Yuliya is actually my second album. My first album, Where Should This Music Be? The Songs of Lola Williams. I was elbow deep in cardboard boxes filled with handwritten manuscripts and looking through and trying to make logical sense of them. And so that was an incredible research project that culminated in an album. And then with Yuliya, it was amazing to use modern research techniques. We received all of her scores over email sent from the Russian State Library. That was 40 scores. That would not have been possible even 10 years ago. So the opportunity to combine both those great passions and then to have it culminate in an album that can be heard around the world, that is incredibly fulfilling to me as an artist and as a historian.
One of my favorite things about recording this CD was the fact that there's no performance history of this music ever. So it's really a sense of entering sort of a musician's Disneyland. I hope that people will say this was the point at which music history of 20th century has been enriched, that we have discovered. It's like discovering a planet in the solar system. It's important. it's there. We just didn't know it was there. So hopefully that's the response.
I hope that this album inspires others to perform her work, research her life, so that 100 years from now, Julia Weissberg Rimsky-Korsakov is a part of the canon, and that people will have forgotten that she was ever forgotten. But if someone's curious and they go back, they will find that this Yuliya album was the spark that lit the fire to bring Julia Weissberg Rimsky-Korsakov's music around the globe.